One of the best extensions for Visual Studio is the Web Essentials extension. You should give this extension a try since you're doing web development. This is an open source project run by Mads Christensen of Microsoft, and it is consistently updated with new features all the time. You can download this extension from vswebessentials.com or from inside of Visual Studio. Just go to Tools, Extensions and Updates. You want to look online in the Visual Studio gallery for Web Essentials 2013. It should be near the top, but you can always search the gallery too. When I click download, it'll bring down the bits, install it into Visual Studio, and then I'll have to restart, so I will be right back. Now that we have Web Essentials installed and Visual Studio has restarted, let's poke around at some of the features. One of the best places to get an idea of the features in this extension is to look under Tools Options and go to the Web Essentials node. Since it is a web developer tool, there's lots of options here revolving around HTML and JavaScript and CSS, but there's also some features that Web Essentials will add to other parts of Visual Studio, like Browser Link. Let's see what that does before we look at these other features. I'm going to run the application, and again, place Visual Studio over here on the left. I can see in Browser Link that I have a couple tabs in Chrome that are open. And if I drop down this menu, one of the new options here will be Design Mode. Design Mode is interesting because there are times when I can just change some text here in the browser. And notice that it has opened up that file, the index.cshtml view in the editor. And if I type, because I don't like the way that text look and I want to try something else, now I can use the browser like a design surface, see what that text looks like. And as I type in this content editable div that Web Essentials has plugged into my browser, the text that I type is sent back over Signal R into Visual Studio, where it is used to update my source code in the view. The other piece that this can do is I can go into inspect mode. And now as I hover over in the browser, you'll notice in the tiny window over there in Visual Studio that we are opening up the file that contains that text. So in this case, it's a partial view called Latest Articles. And now that's open and I can start editing it in Visual Studio too. And this is a wonderful feature when you're working on someone else's project and you're not really sure how the UI is constructed and what files to open to find certain pieces. This is a lot like the Page Inspector settings that were in the last version of Visual Studio, except now instead of using the Page Inspector in Visual Studio, I can actually use my browser to locate the files where the source resides. So Browser Link is one interesting extension point for Web Essentials. It also taps into the editing and build features of Visual Studio. And Web Essentials has a number of rules around JavaScript and CSS that can appear as errors and warnings and messages in the output window in the error list of Visual Studio. For example, under the CSS node, I can turn on rules to disallow overqualified ID selectors. Those can hurt performance inside of a browser. I can also turn on a rule that says small images should be inlined. I'll show you a demonstration of that in just a bit. And then under JS Hint, there's a large number of rules here that revolve around best practices in JavaScript. The default settings for Web Essentials are to be somewhat relaxed, but there are a number of good rules in here. And some of these you might want to turn on. For instance, you might want to require strict mode. ECMAScripts 5's strict mode is implemented in more and more browsers these days. And by turning that on, you avoid a number of problems in JavaScript and also enable more optimizations with the JIT compiler in the browsers. That starts off as false, but like I say, the rules are somewhat relaxed. You can make this more stringent. One rule that is on by default, which is good, is disallow use of undeclared variable, as well as catching unused variables that might be in your source code. And these rules that are on, when you perform a build in Visual Studio, some of them can pop up in the error list. For instance, here's an HTML5 warning saying that this page should have a meta tag, and I can click yes. It will go ahead and add a meta tag into my layout page. I'll need to make the content a little more dynamic. And then quite often when you're editing files, for instance, if I open my CSS file and perform some edits in here, when I do a build, it will also catch problems in my JavaScript files, CSS files. Notice this warning here, browser compatibility. I need to add a missing vendor-specific property to text shadow. If I double-click that, I'm using a text shadow here On some versions of Chrome, there should be a WebKit prefix on this. So if I press Control period, that will open the little drop-down menu. I can say OK, and it will automatically add my WebKit vendor prefix. And it can do this for some of the really difficult areas of CSS where you need lots of vendor prefixes. Areas like animations and transitions, you can end up with 5 or 6 lines of code with all the vendor prefixes for one specific style rule. And then that other rule we saw about inlining small images, that's something where instead of pointing to an external resource, a PNG file that's back on the file system that will cause the browser to do another request to the web server to fetch that, if it is a very small image, I can just hit Control period here and embed the data from that PNG file into the CSS style sheet. It will be embedded as a data URI, which uses base64 encoded data. And now once the browser has downloaded the style sheet, it also has all the image information it needs to make that appear on the screen. It doesn't need to do a separate HTTP request just to fetch a small icon. And these are some of the nice editing features that Web Essentials provides. Let's look at some more in the next clip.